Hi everyone, welcome to BRICS Briefs. Navigating Global Dynamics, a BRICS view on economic resilience and strategic autonomy. In a time of huge global economic change, a chat between Lwandle Fakazi and Dr. Vidhu Shekhar is going to be really interesting. They're both big players from South Africa and India, two of the most important BRICS countries. So they've got unique views on how to deal with the tricky mix of geopolitical challenges, tech innovation, and economic development. First, Lwandle Fakazi, the Africa practice leader at AIA, Africa Investment Advisors, has a really important voice in understanding what's going on with the economy in Africa. We know a lot about African economic ecosystems. He knows a lot about. You've learned a lot from the channel on that. Lwandle knows a lot about African economic systems and has been exploring how African countries can work with other countries to grow in a sustainable way. And we have Dr. Vidhu Shekhar, a big expert in FinTech and financial economics, has some great insights into how new technologies like AI and blockchain can totally change financial systems, especially in the BRICS context. Their chat comes at a really important time because the global economic landscape is going through some major changes, with tensions rising between traditional Western economic powers and emerging economies. The BRICS alliance, made up of about 54.6% of the world's population and a big chunk of the global GDP, is showing itself to be a really important alternative to the usual economic frameworks. So this conversation couldn't be more relevant right now, especially when you think about these points. So South Africa's G20 presidency in 2025, this year. The ongoing changes in BRICS as an economic powerhouse. The impact of new technology on financial and industrial sectors. The need for new ways to make economies stronger. So we'll be talking about important topics like strategic independence, new technology, adapting to change, and working together to develop strategies. By sharing perspectives from South Africa and India, Fakazi and Shekhar will offer a nuanced understanding of how emerging economies can chart independent, sustainable paths in an increasingly complex global environment. So, thanks for tuning in to this deep dive into how countries like South Africa and India are just reacting to global economic challenges. They're not only doing that, but are actually shaping the international economic conversation through clever innovation, tech progress, and teamwork. So, welcome to you both. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. So I've got some questions for both of you. So I'll lead in with a question for one of you, and then if you want to take that up, and if you have any disagreements, you'd like to throw something in there, please do. We have a nice informal discussion. That'd be great. So Lwandle, because it's your first time on the channel, and welcome to the channel, and we really do appreciate your input. So I'll ask you the question first. So on the topic of strategic partnerships and African economic integration, so as the Africa practice leader at AIA, how do you see the role of strategic partnerships in driving economic integration across African nations within the BRICS framework? What unique opportunities and challenges do you identify for collaborative economic development?
No, thank you very much, Glenn. It's a great first question. Just points of clarification, it's Africa International Advisors. Investments, we do that as well, but the company is called Africa International Advisors. But going to your question, it's funny because I just came out of a session inside our organization as we were reflecting upon our strategy and how we see the world. I want to start with the fact that firstly, partnerships are going to be critically important going forward, particularly if you look at the requirements that are in place for Africa's long-term and sustainable development. That is going to be critical. The question though is, what kind of partnerships are going to make sense for Africa? We look to unlock this critical need of development, growth, and creating the right sort of markets and driving the well-being of our citizenry and our people in Africa, where for the longest time, Africa's always been behind the curve. What BRICS offers is, firstly, it creates a platform where, BRICS being an aggregation by consensus by and large, of countries that have a common interest around driving trade, integration, and development for all their countries. It's very important because it underpins Africa having alternative platforms for our voice, for our ideas, for our intellectual autonomy to come through as well, because Africa has ideas, strong ideas and opinions upon how it can develop and how it should grow, especially look at the nuance and complexities of our context as Africa has emerged from colonialism into where it is now. The interesting thing, though, is that as much as we look to platforms such as BRICS, where South Africa being, one of the earlier members, and this now expanding into other countries, including other African countries as well, I still think that, and this is something I'll touch on later on as we go along, but I still think that for these partnerships to work, we have to change our thinking and our mindsets about how Africa interfaces with the world. And I say that because Africa, as a continent, can truly benefit from really unlocking its own regional integration, because there are already a lot of opportunities. There's already a clear path for Africa to become its own, power player, its own sovereign lead in unlocking its potential through partnerships integration. And we have challenges around that, which I'll touch on later on. And I think that to avoid the history where it has been a fragmented approach, which creates imbalances within the region, but also furthers imbalances into how the region sovereign interfaces the world. I think that for me, with BRICS being a consensus-based platform, a platform around integrating marginalized and previously underheard sovereigns within its framework, I do think that we should be intentional as Africans in approaching BRICS as a joint voice, so that we can also integrate that with our agenda around integration for the African region in of itself. So that's what I see as the opportunity, and the challenge is going to be us solving a lot about how we ally and how we integrate domestically, so we can unlock scale and aggregation of those opportunities.
Professor Shekhar, with your familiarity of Africa, because I want to get, both your opinions of your own and also the other. What would you say about what Lwandle has spoken about? Because he's really getting at it, and moving forward. What would you say?
Yeah, no, I think the way the geopolitical scenario is currently configured, right, which is kind of being led by US, and the way it is. If any alternate block, and I'm not saying that as a alternate block as in somebody who is trying to replace US, but somebody more, a block more organically grown, if that has to come, the diversity of the participating nations has to be very high, right? It has to be a microcosm for the overall global landscape itself, right? And if it has to be that way, high diversity, global macro, we need countries across the world to cooperate to kind of mimic this kind of a block. And in that sense, South Africa definitely plays a large role into it, as does other countries, India, China, and I must say that BRICS, in that sense, represents a very, very good diversified collection of nations which can serve that purpose before, right? So the integration of nations beyond the current West has got a large role to play for big regional players like India, like South Africa, like other countries out there. So extremely important role in that sense, overall landscape.
Okay. So, I'll ask you a question, Professor Shekhar. Particularly, this is a very current subject. We're hearing a lot about it, AI and blockchain. Transforming BRICS economic independence. How do you interpret, technologies like AI and blockchain? Are they actually presenting opportunities for BRICS countries to create more independent and resilient economic systems? Or, what specific technological strategies would enhance economic autonomy?
Right. Yes, definitely. The modern technology, whether it's AI or blockchain, the way it is being kind of commoditized and the way it is coming up across the world actually represents a very, very good scenario for countries outside the existing dominant countries to develop their own space per se. I'll give you an example of, let's start with the example of blockchain, and why I like blockchain per se is not just because of the technology, but because blockchain actually represents the birth of fintech as a sector. It's a blockchain and cryptocurrency where it was recognized that tech has got a very, very big influence on finance. So what does blockchain represents? Blockchain represents a global digital ledger. All right. If you with coming of a blockchain, you have got a demonstration and a very, very functional demonstration that a ledger worldwide can work without any middleman, but definitely without large governments into play. So the existence of blockchain itself represents the ability of the world to create ledger beyond the existing global trade ledger. And the current global trade ledger, of course, is the US and NATO and SWIFT, right? And that is the only ledger. So this commoditization, this democratization of technology has given the powers of other countries also to pick up ledgers like this on their own, right? The technology has now moved away from a clutch of bank or a clutch of technologists to do something about that. And that makes the viability of such system existing very high. In fact, it can be argued that cryptocurrencies have comparatively failed to live up to their promises and stuff like that, which might be true in some sense. But that they introduced the concept of digital ledger, digital currency, which is now evolving into things like central bank digital currencies and other. That itself is a great, great kind of giving that it has already given. So that's for blockchain, of course. In terms of AI, there are varied applications. I think the tech democratization overall gives humongous ability for nations to participate in global economy without really undertaking any kind of a population migration and stuff like that. So while I see AI from the economic perspective slightly lesser important to the overall scheme of things as of now, but just that it has got the ability where it can pull up a large chunk of people, a large chunk of people and economy, and patch them up with the global tech per se, that itself represents a great promise.
Mm.
Oh, go ahead, Lwandle.
Thanks. No, Prof. Shekhar, I couldn't agree with you more, Prof. Shekhar, especially for, in my mind, for developing countries. And I'll tell you why. I like how you position, I'll start with the blockchain side of things. And I like how you position it as that democratization of infrastructure to enable to create very diverse, very new and innovative systems. Never mind just payment systems, but systems in general that solve the issue of integrity, on the one side, where you'll be able to have a trusted, immutable database of truth, which is very, very important if you look at a continent like Africa, where there are so many asymmetries of knowledge and asymmetries of truth within the region, which again is part of some of the dynamics that we face in terms of how we drive towards integration, because knowledge and data and information, whether it be in terms of finances, infrastructure, economies, sectors, whatever you're looking at, those asymmetries are part of the barriers for integration, but also part of the barriers when it comes to the trustworthiness of certain landscapes when it comes to attracting investment. So I think that this issue of blockchain as an infrastructure is critical. And what comes above that in terms of applications that can build upon that, that can leverage that going forward based on different consensus mechanisms and etc., then the world opens up. Because then, going back to BRICS, the look towards seeing how we can leverage that technology to create alternative payment platforms, that is now a true, let's call it, democratization of international settlements, right? Which is currently ran within a very particular construct. And again, Professor Shekhar, you're probably more of an expert than me in this area of finance, but from my understanding, if I look at what is possible, you can create different pathways for trade, different pathways for remittance, different pathways for inter-regional economic activity. But it's all underpinned, again, going back to the issue of consensus. Do we all agree on what value means, how you underlie that value? Because currently, when it comes to the monetary system, I mean, we can all agree since Britain was going forward, it has been largely a US-based settlement system, right? People, when we quote internationally, because of all these various currency risks, it's driven by, US-based settlements. But the question then becomes, if we're going to create a BRICS platform, and we're very intentional about it as one avenue in driving towards an alternative, what is going to be the consensus around how we interpret and share value? I was looking, for example, at a case study. I think it was between, if I'm not mistaken, Bangladesh and and Iran, and they indicated that ever since, and I've always been corrected, but they indicated that ever since there were sanctions on Iran, it created significant barriers for trade with a very close trade partner, and now the pathways of driving commerce are so much more convoluted because it was exchange, raise dollars, transfer dollars, settle in dollars, and fluctuations. It becomes a very convoluted mess and increases the friction and cost of trade. But imagine a platform where the underlying there's a shared consensus of value, however that's determined multilaterally or bilaterally, and then you have this accessible, transparent, and immutable infrastructure which enables for settlement. Can you just imagine how much more enabling then trade becomes a mechanism for integration, but for development? So the blockchain side, I couldn't agree with you more, Professor Shekhar. I think that developing countries, and by virtue of that, the BRICS platform will definitely benefit from that. I'm sorry, I'm saying that I'm breaking up. Can you still hear me now, colleagues? Am I coming through clearly before I go to AI?
No, you're actually fine. I think the producer's end might be breaking up, so it's okay.
Oh.
No, you're good.
Yeah, on the AI side, Professor Shekhar, just building on that, one of the things that for me is, and it goes back to a concept we're discussing today in our outlook and strategy session as African International Advisors today, is that we were talking about for almost conceptualizing the different phases of how Africa has integrated with the world. Most notably has been the era of colonialism from a resource perspective, by and large extraction of people and resources. That evolved into a different relationship where it was about how, as you look towards driving development and integrating different formats and thinking regarding what is the right form of economics, market-based, authoritarian, etc. So multilateral financial institutions played a big role in, let's call it, driving the developmental agenda of Africa, and still do, the World Bank, IMF, etc. And I won't get into that right now because we could go on and on about that. But what's happening now, and again, one of our partners, Reza Suleiman, when he made this point, I was very, very intrigued by it. I didn't think about it this way, is that we're now entering into an era of a technology interface with Africa. And you can see that each trend will again, by and large, behind, because it's again an importation of capability, which is not wrong because we must develop from somewhere, right? But is for all the benefits of AI, is the risk that it's going to be another platform of a know-how which we will be behind in? And I think the critical question for Africa is, how does AI benefit the developmental and prosperity of Africa going forward? But with that being said, I still think that digital technology such as AI, blockchain, etc., are becoming more and more accessible. What's happening with DeepSeek in terms of its, being a technology, AI technology with improved economics in terms of accessibility, those kind of innovations are critical for Africa, because then it becomes a low-hanging fruit on the platform for economic development. So I still have high hopes and belief that AI can fundamentally change the landscape for our development and growth. But a part of that is making sure that we have a very clear agenda of how we leverage this technology and domesticate it, not just in terms of its utilization, but domesticate it in terms of how to build, develop, maintain, and innovate these technologies for our own purposes going forward. And my last point is that, and that when I was in Qatar, I saw that happening at the Qatar, Tech Summit, where last year, where there were innovators from Africa who are creating AI-based solutions that are even crossing barriers of linguistics, and I'll share a link to that. But that's a demonstration of domesticating that know-how for solving true African problems, and part of those problems are the diversity of linguistics in Africa as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Oh, that's cool. Actually, and that brings sort of to the next topic, which I wanted to ask you, Lwandle. And Vidhu, if you could, please comment as we go through this, because I'm asking on Africa, but I want to know about from India's perspective too. So Lwandle, the BRICS impact on African industrial development, given your expertise in African economic practice, how can BRICS nations support the development of indigenous industries in Africa, particularly in creating more resilient and, as you've spoken about, innovative economic systems that can compete on the global stage?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's by and large quite clear. I think that if you look at one of the key drivers for economic development, even in the developed world, it's always underpinned by know-how. So by and large, we're in a resource space in terms of, by and large, our economies are driven by our resources, particularly when it comes to trade, although we do have growing, developing service-based economies in tourism, agriculture, into the food, agriculture links to tourism, etc. But I think that BRICS, the BRICS platform, can play a critical role in facilitating, one, accessibility of enabling an attractive and fair access to capital, because of potentially lowering the perceived risks in terms of investing in the African continent by virtue of understanding and know-how. And I think China is a great example of that as a specific country that has really made significant strides in being an alternative for investments in Africa. And I think that partnership has long legs to it. But with that investment of capital, I think what's more important, again, to drive true industrialization over the long term, is the transfer of know-how and capabilities. I think that, for me, is probably one of the areas, and this is across all areas, both technically in terms of delivering on industrialization, but also in terms of know-how, in terms of how we also bring in the right institutional development, regulatory-wise, policy-wise, just get a better understanding of, as we develop, what are some of the challenges that we foresee, and what we can learn from our partners so that we can mitigate and leapfrog as quickly as possible. And I think that as things stand right now, it definitely, a lot of work is happening through NDB and other partners within the BRICS landscape. But I think a lot more can be done in exchange of know-how to fast track that progress.
Okay. Vidhu, would you like to add to that or bounce off that?
No, I mean, definitely good step. China is a very, very good example of how they have done on that side. But I suspect a lot of this development would be geopolitical in nature. And I suspect that a lot of this development, not just for South Africa, but the countries across the world, definitely non-West countries, the system is kind of going to be forced, as I suspect US kind of willingly decouples from the global trade systems. We are already seeing the early signs of it with Trump acting the way he did. There have been a lot of news generated by the new presidency of US post Trump taking over on 20th of Jan. But if you look at it, it's and there has been good news, bad news for the world. But if you look at it, the kind of attention and the kind of policies being discussed and the kind of communication being received is significantly harsher for countries which are nearer to US compared to outside the US line per se, right? So the communication and their attention on the neighborhoods of US is significantly higher, right? And I think that might be a so to say canary in the overall mine, where we might see US getting more regional focused rather than global focused. And the moment it starts doing that, automatically there will be a space created for other countries in the world to do something about it, right? So a lot of these systems needs to come up, and a lot of these systems or internal systems to manage a world where US is not really that interfering or that higher presence partner is going to come very fast to the world, and they would have to kind of navigate through that.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a very important topic there with, what we term financial resilience, in a changing global landscape, with Trump coming in, it's very uncertain. So Vidhu, given the economic uncertainties, what innovative financial models and technological solutions can BRICS nations develop to enhance their economic resilience and reduce vulnerability to external economic shocks.
Right. So I think the stage is reaching for almost an emergency kind of a scenario for an alternative system to exist. The global landscape is currently dominated by what we call as SWIFT, which essentially is the dollar/USD system that backs the global trade. When I say dollar and USD system, the idea is that the global trade, the menu pricing or the trade pricing is done in dollars, and the settlement or the settling of the accounts between countries is done in US treasuries, because the settling has to be an asset while the accounting can be in a currency. All right. The problem with this scenario is that, and this was something that Keynes highlighted way back when the system was being instituted post World War II itself, that if a country's currency and if their treasuries is treated as a reserve asset, the country itself would be forced to issue more and more debt. It would have to be by default in a fiscal deficit, right? And if you look at last couple of, I would say years, but definitely last couple of quarters, the kind of debt that US has been issuing has been a lot, all right? And the reason there is to it is because once Fed has increased the interest rates, the demand for US treasuries has gone through the roof. It's being a reserve asset of the world. It's the safest asset out there. And if a safest asset out there is yielding you, 4%, 5%, that's a very, very good investment scenario. And everybody wants a piece of that. That inevitably leads to going up of dollar as a currency per se. And if US stops issuing debt, US stops issuing newer and newer debt, the US currency can see a large deflation. When I say deflation, it essentially means US dollars can go actually really climb up, right? And the moment that happens, it will start sending kind of waves into the global monetary and trade system, right? And I suspect with the new administration taking in their focus on controlling the government budget, their focus on issuing lesser debt, their focus on where the money is going and stuff like that, they might tone down their debt issue, and that might create a reverberance across the world. And US is in a peculiar position in regarding to that, right? So what kind of a debt I, as an India, issues does not have the consequences for, let's say, South Africa, right? But what and how much of debt the US issues, that has the consequences for me and you, South Africa, both, right? This leads to US finding it really difficult to manage its budget while keeping their own and the global interest in mind. They have been trying to do that this way and that way for some time now, but I suspect with the new administration taking over, their focus would be increasingly more internal rather than outside. So they'll issue debt which is required for internal purposes, not from outside purposes. And the moment this starts happening, there would be a grave risk to the global trade system per se, right? And I don't think so this is too far. And the moment this happens, the need of having an alternate payment system which is not entirely dependent on US is going to be felt very, very acutely, right? And that is where BRICS can actually build in something which can help not just BRICS countries but the countries overall, which is essentially having another payment system into place which is not entirely dependent on the US per se, and therefore is somewhat shielded from the economic waves that might arise from US because of the changes in their administration and their way of thinking about the world and themselves.
Absolutely. I'd like to comment on that, Clive, as well. I mean,
Sure.
that analysis, especially on the issue of resilience, and the fact that, based on what you said, Prof. Shekhar, sorry, that we are currently, the way that I see it, and I have thought about it a lot, particularly from looking backwards all the way to 2008 and where we are now. I'm worried that the fragility of our current system is starting to really come out and emerge more prominently. If you look at also the frequency of some of these financial economic events as well that are happening. And when you start seeing the section of monetary instability, and then you overlap that with geopolitical and security instability as well, you start getting multiple flashpoints that start brewing towards a conclusion. And I think the end conclusion will not be now, may not be next year or next 10 years, but the end conclusion is the fundamental shift of power. And I think that's what we're seeing actually. As we discuss BRICS, as we discuss what's happening in the world, we're fundamentally discussing a shift in power. And the question is, what comes next? Is it another, by and large, monopolar order, or is it going to be something which is more, let's call it, integrated and inclusive? And I think what the BRICS platform offers is an ideology of inclusive, let's call it inclusivity for collective sovereignty. And I think that's why the BRICS platform, just touching back on the issue of monetary policy, that's why the BRICS platform is so important, because the idea of having a shared common interest and shared risk in sort of how we integrate and drive towards alternative systems that enable for trade, movements of currency, value, etc. That is an ideal that I buy into, because I worry about the fact that the majority of African, sub-Saharan African countries, which also have significant debts, unsustainable debt levels, are all, or by and large, is dollar denominated. So that becomes also another geopolitical lever that further entrenches the current dynamics that we see today, and limits what I talked about in terms of sovereignty within the region, and also focusing more on collectivism and regional integration, and collective competitiveness, as opposed to this dependency. And I think that's the word I want to use, dependency. I think we have to shift from a dependency-based system, and we have to have more shared sovereignty in whatever comes out as the system of the future.
That's really important. You know, as you two are talking, you know, these subjects, and we're sort of covering very broad subjects, but also you're getting a little bit detailed because you have specialties. I'm curious, and I'm going to ambush you both here. So just, you know, what you'd like to say. So I'm putting you on the spot, right? I'm going to test you. I know, see, for me, from my perspective, India is fairly advanced in IT and agriculture, which is a little bit of a paradox. And I know in Africa, there is a lot of resources, and there is a lot of very deep cultural and a lot of wisdom too. That's also in India, but you know, I'm sort of talking popularly, right, for the audience. Is there a way that, is there something that India and South Africa could cooperate in, you know, mutually? Because the BRICS, the BRICS countries that have come in, it's been sort of what we're told, sort of, that they offer, like with Africa, they offer a lot of resource rich. Is there something that Africa and India could cooperate on that could be complementary, rather than maybe being complementary for the other BRICS nations?
Do you want to go for it, Prof, or should I take a stab at it?
Yeah. No, definitely. See, the way world has shaped up, you know, we have seen a time of West dominance. Prior to that, of course, we had post World War II Cold War system and stuff like that. We have also seen a kind of a partial China dominance for some time, but I suspect that China might be reaching a stage of where US and Japan are, where their growth might not be that great, right? So if you look at the overall world, the areas which are kind of exhausted, so exhausted is a strong word to use, but let's go with that, kind of exhausted the growth, the economic growth, and what remains, if you look at whatever remains among the countries which have not really exhausted the economic growth and have a long way to go, India and Africa actually shine a lot, right? So these are the two spaces where a lot of future economic activities is going to take place, right? And how does this economic activity take place? You know, there is one model which is a monopoly, somewhat of a bit forced model that has kind of been practiced by the West. There is another model of China, which unfortunately has resulted in a lot of debt burdens for a lot of countries. And there is a third model which can perhaps emerge, which is of a cooperative dynamics, or cooperative cultural and economic space that will serve, where the partnership is not dominated by one country or the other country, but it's co-participate in the overall development of them, of both of the players, right? And in that sense, that Africa and India, Africa in overall, and South Africa in particular, and India on the other side, can have a space created and can demonstrate that there can be an economic alignment without necessarily one being a big brother, other being a small brother, and that big brother, small brother keep changing from time to time, kind of a scenario, right? There can be a coalition, or there can be a partnership of equals that can rest much more on the organic similarities that exist between the countries, the complementary similarities that exist within the countries, rather than any other way of, or ulterior motives behind doing a partnership per se. And there are a lot of commonalities in Africa and India, South Africa and India in that sense. A lot of things that these two economics, these two big countries, these two big almost, Africa is of course a continent as overall. India can be called as a subcontinent per se. So a lot of scope on that side per se. Particularly, I will say, in demonstrating that a relationship of equals can exist.
Absolutely. I absolutely, and I think from my perspective, in just zooming in what you've said, Prof, I think that one of the areas, if I look at, first of all, between South Africa and India, I think we have great relations. I think culturally as well as economically, I think we have great relations, and I think that that extends by and large into other parts of Africa. But I can talk as a South African to say that the relationship between South Africa and India definitely has more room for growth. But where it is right now is also fantastic from that perspective. I do think that I agree that it's about managing the nature of that big brother versus small brother dynamic, because by and large, that tends to be the prevailing attitude, not necessarily from India by any means, but more globally when it comes to interfacing with the continent, and the continent has a lot to offer from that perspective. One of the areas that I think, and I saw it's interesting enough, that trip to Qatar last year was very informative for me. But one of the areas that I saw was, as we were engaging and looking at all the various technologies that were being demonstrated, and we found that a lot of Indian firms, small, medium, and even large Indian firms, that were at the top tier, at the cutting edge of digital technology. And I think that is a critical area of intense expansion of collaboration between India and Africa at large, because Africa is hungry for implementing cost-effective models, both into the development all the way to implementation and commercialization of technology. Because once you solve the question of stability in economics, Africa is a market where you can have expansion. And I think that interplay of the technological developments that India's gone through, both in terms of on the software side, but also on the hardware side as well. People forget that there's significant infrastructure and hardware skills that are present in India, and you overlap that with the potential of translating our regional resources in Africa and beneficiating them, not just exporting them as raw products, and how that intersection then creates a platform for joint manufacturing, partnerships around creating infrastructure, partnerships around building resilient systems for the future across levels. I think that we're just actually the beginning of the interplay between India and Africa, actually.
Yeah, the human resource potential is fantastic between South Africa and India. I mean, as you've seen with China, when they have been building things, they say, okay, we're going to build this bridge. And they put it up in a matter of weeks, right? Where Western developed, so-called developed countries take literally years, right? So anyway, again, I'm very optimistic.
But Clive, can I come in on that just very quickly? There are dynamics as to why that is. There's a lot to it, but just an example. I mean, it's case by case, but even the nature of the political system and leadership systems can prompt different responses. So where you're very free markets, and they can be the assumption that free market systems are more efficient, I always argue that you're making a very big assumption about how rational free market players are in the system, right?
Yes.
So I argue that, and that's probably why I see some of those trends. But when you have a system which may have its own imperfections, but is largely a blend of authoritarianism with a blend of capitalism, then you start seeing, maybe some inefficiencies or maybe some unrealized results in other parts, but definitely when it comes to getting things done, they get done. Now, Africa's problem is partially this area where, and if you look at performance, and this ties back to why we need partners, very much so. When we look at it as a critical issue is that it's not the idea that's the problem. We have a lot of intellectual muscle within the continent, and I think we need to have more autonomy around that. But Africa's problem, in my opinion, is execution. It's really at its execution, and some of the work that we've done in South Africa around contributing to how we implement on infrastructure development reforms and build institutional systems that can actually get things done. I think that's the next step of the continent, because without that, when you don't get results, you don't build credibility for the future. So I think it's a common challenge, but I think it's quite prevalent in our continent as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. I see some in my interactions. Sorry, Professor, I just want to say in response to Lwandle, I see my interactions not just because I'm interfacing about BRICS, but I'm having many interactions with South Africans where the competence level is very high. And, and that goes against the sort of popular narrative, right? That's projected about South Africa, about Africa. So I'm optimistic. But let me put something to Professor. So a little bit closing. We're about 41 minutes. We've got about 20 minutes, so feel free. But on closing, Vidhu, looking ahead, 10 to 15 years, which is a fairly long time, how do you envision the BRICS nations fundamentally reimagining the global financial architecture through technical innovation, which is where you do have a specialty? What breakthrough developments do you anticipate will be most significant in shifting the current economic power dynamics?
Right. I would say BRICS is extremely well placed, because if you look at the countries which are involved, there are all kinds of countries. We have countries which have got fiscal debt, fiscal deficit. We have the countries which have got fiscal surplus. We have countries which have got natural resources. We have countries which have got ability to process that natural resource and re-export them per se. So BRICS in that sense represents a kind of a mini picture of the world as such, right? The disparity is not really a disparity, and there is a very thin line between disparity and diversity. And I would say BRICS is more diverse rather than having a very disparate nature per se, and that leads BRICS to have the ability to form systems that can directly be taken up and put for the world overall use of the overall world per se, right? So as a purely economic block emerging, BRICS serves as an extremely good purpose, right? If you look at it, the way the current system is and the way the current system is going, I suspect in another couple of years we already finding a lot of issues in the global geopolitical and global trade systems. One classic example that we can possibly talk about is inability of the central banks of the world to do something independent of Fed, right? So we all talk about central bank independence, but increasingly you see all central bank have to align with the actions of Fed. If they don't align, their currency tends to fall dramatically, which we saw in the case of Bank of Japan, where it has now been forced to increase rate and to kind of go up because the USD yen exchange rate has moved against them for a long period of time, leading to a long or large inflation within the Japanese system, right? So India or Africa or even to a good extent China, they cannot have an independent monetary system because the Fed is doing a few things and because the dollar is serving as the currency in which the world works. And this cannot continue, right? So there is no reason why I should not be able to cut my rates sitting over here in India and provide benefit or debt to my micro and small enterprises just because Fed is currently at a very high rate, right? But there's no other way that we can go about it, right? So this central bank independence has kind of eroded, not in terms of their relationship to their respective government, but in terms of their relationship to the Fed, which is such an arbitrary thing to happen, right? There are other issues, right? There are other issues like today, if I want to have a pricing system which is separate from dollar, we want to have a global trade pricing system which does not involve US. We just can't do it. There are too many complexities into it. There is no alternate system that is existing per se, right? A lot of people talk this as a swift dominance. I wouldn't say dominance is the correct word. It's a swift monopoly, right? And if you look at the economic way of thinking at it, monopoly has got significant issues that are attached to it, right? So there is no alternative system. If something happens in that system, what will the global trade do? How would they manage it? etc, etc, right? So we need some diversity that should come into place. We need also the idea of not having a monopoly is also that there is no one person on whom whose decisions can have a very, very wide repercussions, because that's the only system that's existing. So in that sense, I see that a BRICS system can emerge very strongly and can give to the world something which is an alternate to the current existing SWIFT system. Interestingly, this is of course not just a economic thing. This is also a geopolitical thing. And we recently had the new administration, the Trump administration of US, talking about tariffs, etc., coming up if there is an attempt to do any alternate reserve currency against the dollar, right? Which is fair from the US side. Why would it let go of its monopoly, which it enjoys, right? But interestingly, what can be done despite this, and we have to, of course, take all this competing powers into account, and we cannot really disrupt the system. See, the way to reform a system can be to kill the system, create a new one, or do not disrupt the system, but let another system slide in as well completely, and that way, you don't go from one monopoly to another monopoly. You go from a monopoly to a duopoly or to a diversified system that is existing. So we can definitely think about a CBDC based or a BRICS based system which does not has a alternative reserve currency into place. It can be a purely payment system which utilizes the member countries currency into its place and can work accordingly out of it. So not going from dollar dominance to some other currency dominance, but going from dollar dominance to no dominance at all, a diversified system. And we can, of course, there are ways to do this, and that can get very technical, so I'll skip that part. But yes, blockchain can play a role into this, because of having a distributed system, you can have a mechanism where a lot of countries have the authority to come in, or authority to modify, or authority to frame rules for the alternate system that exists, rather than just one country handling it. So it can truly be a diversified system that can be created, and such a system, if created, will benefit a lot to the economic well-being of the world, that a lot of us are not able to currently achieve because of a single currency dominance.
That's the system we've got at the moment. So an alternative would be great, which is what we're talking about, right? We're bringing two people who are in totally different countries to talk about that. And we have an audience listening. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'm saying that given the geopolitical scenario, I think this can still be managed. We can have a system which does not necessarily has an alternative reserve currency system. We can have a pure payment system into place, which just replaces the bilateral systems that are there. All right. So there are alternate ways in which this can be deployed, and well deployed.
Yeah, there's technology, right? We're moving. There's different systems have come, and we can look at it and try it. Yeah. Well, Lwandle, would you like to say something on the the outlook?
So the way that I see it is, and this is where for me it becomes interesting and I guess pragmatic. I mean, Prof is absolutely correct in terms of how he's positioning the opportunities and what could happen. I think the challenge is always the understanding of how these things always link back to the issue of power at the end of the day. And this is why, as we've been engaging, I've been very intentional about the use of the word sovereignty, because ultimately what we're talking about is the right to self-determination. And that includes the rights to access democracy you want to access, the right to determine your policy agenda and how you want to implement it, the right to partner, and the right to have favorable terms if you should you wish to partner. And I think that's actually what we're grappling with. And what's becoming more interesting is that the barrier is no longer the technology, the systems, right? I think the use case and the potential, yes, there must be more development, but the use cases are evolving and they're getting there over time. There's still things to sort out. Where the rubber hits the road is, what does then that mean for the new, let's call it geopolitical relations of the future? Especially when it comes to issues of trade and also how trade is protected. If you look at how the nature of the current security order has been established. So for me, I think that from a technological perspective, definitely, I think nothing stops us from being intentional about looking at alternatives when it comes to creating a different financial, fiscal, and monetary environment. The question becomes, are we all on the same page in terms of how equitable this technology can become by virtue of how democratized and how accessible it is, and then how then does that reform not just on the interplay on a regional level or cross-border level, but even domestically as well within countries. It changes the landscape of what it means to regulate. It changed the landscape of what it means to sandbox and create alternative models going forward. It changes a lot of things, and I think that's the part that I think the world's actually grappling with, because again, it's about how the nature of control and power is shifting, and then what it means to have sovereigns, partnerships, multilateral institutions, bilateral agreements within that world going forward.
Yeah. Well, I want to give you an opportunity, Lwandle, to give a closing remark. You know, and you've commented on the question I gave to Vidhu into the future. But from your perspective, the vision for African economic development over the next decade, how do you see BRICS playing a transformative role in realizing this vision?
Yes. Oh yeah, that's easy. That's an easy one. I'm looking forward to that question. Our vision for Africa is very simple, right? We want a prosperous Africa. That's simple. We want a prosperous Africa that has its own standing within the global landscape because it is sovereign. It has the ability and the power for self-determination. And my vision for Africa starts not necessarily with economics, because I think economics is largely a question of the results. I think I'd rather start on my vision in terms of how Africa operates. My vision for Africa is an Africa that is integrated and inclusive in its diversity, which is something which we talk about in South Africa a lot. The president in his State of the Nation address yesterday talked about that, that you can be diverse and inclusive. And I think that's the most important thing. We need to really be intentional about looking at our collective potential and not being fragmented and distracted by very narrow interests. That's the first part that I think is very important. And once we align on that and we domesticate those agreements, those protocols, as it were, and agree on them, and we domesticate them into our sovereigns, the next step is to ensure that our institutions are fit for purpose, to make sure that they ultimately execute that agenda. That's very important. I saw a comment from someone in the chat who was talking about, come to Africa and see how incompetent our government is, etc. There are challenges in the continent. I did not run away from that. I work with governments quite a bit, and there are challenges in that government. But is it ours to simply complain and to look and say, look at how much this is failing? It's good to have accountability. We need that, a lot of that in the continent. But any democracy is underpinned by one core principle amongst others, and that is active citizenry. And that is active citizenry, not in just paying your taxes, not just in terms of how you engage in public discourse, but being a part of the process of legislation, being a part of the political process, being a part of processes that are in place where if we can show scale on the individual level, it aggregates, and then reform happens and pushes back on some of the things that we're seeing are going wrong. So I think that institutionally, all sides must come to the party, and we must resolve our institutions, because what that then does, going back to the BRICS side, it ensures that there is a strong, solid, and aggregated and empowered platform that can ensure that it engages with platforms like BRICS fairly, learning from some of the disparities we've experienced in the past. I think there's a lot of potential in BRICS, but I also think Africa has the right to choose and to also be very intentional about what it looks for in any partnership, whether it be BRICS or not. And I think that's the position that I would take in terms of my aspiration for Africa, that it has to be sovereign, it has to be underpinned by fundamental principles that must be held true. There has to be accountability, there has to be active citizenry, very robust and intentional institutions that are capacitated and can be held accountable. And also, by virtue of that, we should use that and leverage that to have very constructive and very intentional relationships with any partner. But I think BRICS does have a very compelling proposition to offer to the continent.
I have to say, I totally agree with you, Lwandle. That is citizenry, active citizenry participation, and in the aggregate, I totally agree. And that message, you communicated that very strongly with a lot of intention, and hopefully people get that more and more. And I think they are. People are seeing that they can individually, and as you say, in the aggregate, they can have control. But then I think that's the problem with our leaders. They've seen that there are issues with the population, but I think that can be addressed with education and then optimism. Yeah. And visionaries, poets, the culture, the individual culture of different regions of the countries. But look, we've got 5 minutes left or so. Professor Shekhar, is there something that you'd like to say to the audience? Maybe have a plug, something, and then I'll give Lwandle. Yeah.
No, actually, very, very well said by Lwandle in terms of the people-to-people participation and people-to-people exchange out there. We tend to look at economics as an isolated movement of goods and cash per se, but really economics is as much about society and about societal movement as it is about goods and cash movements per se, right? So economic integration without cultural integration, economic integration without people integration is always a temporary integration. It will come and go, it will come and go. It cannot survive for that long period of time. So if we have to build a resilient system, we need to have people-to-people, society-to-society interaction, society-to-society interaction in all sense, sharing of technology, sharing of education, sharing of culture, sharing of all aspects of living per se, right? And there I see the more I look at the future, more I look at the diverse kind of countries getting up, the more I'm optimistic about that this is how it's going to pan out, right? And as we discussed, technology is also aiding that now, right? So we are really getting up to open technology now. Open source is becoming a wonderful thing. We just saw how DeepSeek came in and kind of completely challenged the dominance of OpenAI as an US-based LLM technologies, right? So that aptly shows that even technology in modern world is no more can be controlled within borders, right? Even the top technologies, the cutting edge technology, something that is developed just a couple of years ago, can go out and become other countries' technology in very, very short period of time.
Oh, we've lost the sound on you, Professor.
Oh dear, I'll be very bad.
Yeah, we just missed like the last 5 seconds of what you were saying. I think it's on your end because you're not muted. No, we can't. It happens, right? These are live shows. This is what happens. But it's okay. That's we're going to end off soon. I'll just give Lwandle an opportunity. There's something you'd like to say, Lwandle?
I think from my side, thanks, Clive. And sorry, Prof, I was really enjoying the point you're making there. I think you're about to come to a conclusion. But from our side, what I will say is this. Firstly, this platform is very important, and I think that the dialogues that are being had here should continue so we can get diverse opinion, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to be in this platform. Secondly, I do want to stress that in these discussions, it doesn't take away from the challenges that are real and pragmatic, but I think it's also important for us to own and demonstrate that there are paths, if well considered, can ultimately have a prosperous outcome for everybody. And I think that we should be intentional, all of us, in having these dialogues and then taking them home to see how we can, in our small ways, start moving the needle to create the kind of prosperous future that we want for all of us, and also including Africa as well. And lastly, I think that as institution, Africa's National Advisors, we take this very seriously. And our mission really going forward is to ensure that whatever we do, whatever work we do, whatever partners we work with, whatever dialogues or conferences we engage in, we spread the message regarding African sovereignty and ensuring that that as we partner and collect and collectively engage with various colleagues across the world, that Africa's intellectual autonomy comes through and can demonstrate an outcome which is positive for everyone to share.
No, great. Thank you very much. Thank you both. Sorry, Professor, we lost you there on your audio. That's show business, right? But we're going to have you back. Oh, no, I can hear you now. So
you can hear me.
That's good. Yeah. But thank you very much, both of you. And we'd love to have you back on. If there's something that you want to, that's it. Maybe it's more current. If there's something important that you're working on that you want to bring to an audience, our audience is here. They'll listen. The people who want to listen, please let us know. But we'll end off now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Fantastic.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this BRICS Brief, a live show on India and South Africa. Please share this with your network if you enjoyed it. If you liked it, please like it. If you didn't like it, press the down button if there's one. If there isn't, share it and say that you didn't like it. Say why. Please comment. Tell us what's going on. Have this conversation, as Lwandle was saying. Talk about it with others. Tell them what you think. It could be a good conversation starter. So we hope you enjoyed it. Please come to the next one. Bye for now.